They're saying he doesn't even know where he is any more childlike, confused, detached. But what if that's not the truth? What if the most disturbing part of this case isn't what happened inside that house, but what happened long before anyone was watching? And what if the story you think you know about Nick Reiner is missing its most dangerous chapter? For weeks now, a single narrative has quietly taken hold around the Nick Reiner case. That he is no longer fully present. That he wanders through confinement confused, disconnected, almost childlike. That he doesn't understand where he is or what he's done. On the surface, it sounds like a tragic psychological collapse. But within the first moments of examining this story closely, something feels off. Because when a case this serious produces such a clean, convenient explanation so early, investigators know to slow down, not speed up. What makes this story matter isn't just the brutality of what happened inside the Reiner home. It's what that narrative is doing now. Public perception is already shifting. Sympathy is forming. Questions about accountability are being quietly replaced with questions about mental incapacity. And all of that is happening before the full timeline has even been laid out. That's the danger zone. Because once a story settles into a single explanation, everything else starts to disappear. This case doesn't exist in isolation. Nick Reiner wasn't a stranger to intervention. Years before the tragedy, there were documented struggles, mental health concerns, substance issues, financial instability, and most critically, a conservatorship, not a financial one like the Britney Spears case everyone knows, but a far more invasive legal structure tied directly to psychiatric oversight. An LPS conservatorship created under a 1967 California law designed for people deemed unable to safely manage their own lives. That detail alone should stop anyone from accepting the current narrative at face value. Because an LPS conservatorship isn't something courts hand out casually. It usually begins after involuntary psychiatric holds. It allows medical and legal authorities to override personal autonomy in the name of safety. It means professionals once believed Nick Reiner could not be trusted with his own decisions. And yet, that conservatorship ended after just 1 year. Quietly, without public explanation, without renewal, without clarity. That's where the timeline fractures. If Nick Reiner was once considered so unstable that the court intervened, why was that oversight removed? And if it truly worked, if he recovered, why are we now being told he is completely disconnected from reality again? Those two claims cannot comfortably coexist. Either the system failed, or the story being told now is incomplete. Enter Moreno O'Connell, a former FBI agent who didn't just follow this case from a distance, but from the inside of the neighborhood itself. Living only blocks away from where the Reiner tragedy unfolded, O'Connell has quietly tracked the case from day one. Not through headlines, but through documents, patterns, and procedural gaps. Her expertise isn't speculation, it's structural. She understands how federal investigations unfold, how mental health narratives intersect with legal strategy, and how information gets buried when it becomes inconvenient. According to sources familiar with her work, what she's uncovered raises serious concerns about how much of Nick Reiner's history was shielded from public view. Unusual legal protections, sealed records, barriers that prevented full transparency. These aren't coincidences. They're systems, and systems don't activate themselves. At the same time, conflicting reports began to surface about Nick's condition in custody. Some described him as unstable and confused. Others, including courtroom observers, described something very different. A man responding clearly to a judge. A man acknowledging questions. A man tracking conversations. Calm, aware, present. That contradiction matters more than any single headline. Because in high-stakes cases, behavior becomes evidence. And when behavior shifts, depending on context, private confinement versus public courtroom, investigators ask why. Was this deterioration sudden? Was it gradual? Or was it strategic? Experts like Dr. Drew had already warned early on that cases involving family violence often involve fugue states, substance-induced psychosis, or a combination of both. But he also cautioned against assuming memory loss or confusion automatically equals truth. People in altered states can appear sincere while still being unreliable narrators of their own actions. And in some cases, that ambiguity becomes the defense. Which brings us to the most unsettling question of this first chapter. If Nick Reiner truly doesn't understand what he's done, why does his past show such careful awareness of consequences? Why did legal structures once exist to limit his choices? And why did those structures disappear just before everything collapsed? Because the moment you stop looking at this case as a sudden breakdown and start looking at it as a long, unmanaged unraveling, the story changes completely. And this is only the beginning. To understand what really happened in the Nick Reiner case, you have to step away from the night of the tragedy and look at the system that surrounded him long before it occurred. Because this wasn't a life spiraling in secret. It was a life being actively managed, monitored, restricted, and then, inexplicably, released back into the wild without a safety net. An LPS conservatorship is one of the most extreme forms of legal intervention available under California law. It doesn't focus on wealth or celebrity assets. It focuses on control. Control over treatment. Control over movement. Control over decision-making. Courts only approve it when mental instability is deemed serious enough to threaten the person or those around them. And once it's in place, it usually stays in place, often for years. That's why the duration of Nick Reiner's conservatorship has become one of the most troubling aspects of this case. According to insiders familiar with the documents, it lasted roughly 1 year. No renewal, no extension, no public explanation. That alone raises alarms. Because conservatorship don't end quietly unless someone pushes for it, either the conservator, the family, or the court itself. And in every scenario, a judgment is being made. Someone, somewhere, decided Nick no longer needed supervision. So who made that call? Family members reportedly played a central role in the arrangement. Not as punishers, but as protectors. The goal wasn't humiliation. It was containment. Those close to the Reiners say the conservatorship existed largely to stop financial chaos and behavioral volatility that had become impossible to manage. Whenever Nick had access to money, it disappeared. Credit cards were maxed out. Cash evaporated. And when funds ran dry, the behavior escalated. Insiders describe a pattern that repeated itself again and again. Nick would gain access to resources. He would burn through them. Then conflict would follow. The conservatorship wasn't just about money, it was about stability, removing the triggers that sent everything off the rails. And yet, despite those patterns, the conservatorship ended. Some believe it was an act of hope. The Reiners were known for giving second chances, for believing improvement was possible if trust was restored. Friends describe Rob and Michelle Reiner as parents who struggled with the impossible balance between protecting their child and respecting his autonomy. They wanted to believe he could handle responsibility again. They wanted to believe the worst was behind them. But others believe something else happened. Confidential sources suggest the conservatorship became a flashpoint of resentment inside the home. Nick reportedly viewed it not as help, but as an attack on his identity. Being legally controlled, especially as an adult, cut directly into his pride. Discussions about renewing it allegedly sparked intense arguments. The idea of extending oversight was seen by Nick as proof that no one trusted him, and that was something he could not tolerate. This matters because resentment doesn't disappear when a legal structure ends. It mutates. And if the conservatorship was lifted under pressure, emotional or otherwise, it means the system didn't end because stability was achieved. It ended because conflict became unbearable. At the same time, reports began circulating about substance use. Methamphetamine, in particular, entered the conversation. Experts have long documented its effects: paranoia, aggression, impulsivity, psychosis. In violent incidents, it's often present. But hey, race where the timeline complicates things again. Nick was reportedly off all substances once incarcerated. If drugs were the sole driver, improvement would be expected. Instead, we're told his condition worsened. That contradiction has divided experts. Some argue prolonged mental illness can outlast substance influence. Others argue sustained confusion without improvement raises questions of authenticity. And that brings us back to motive. Because mental instability isn't just a diagnosis in court, it's a strategy. Sources close to the case say legal discussions around diminished capacity began early, long before the public narrative hardened. Attorneys don't improvise these approaches overnight. They evaluate history. They assess documentation. They decide which version of reality survives scrutiny. And in Nick Reiner's case, The paper trail is both extensive and selective. What the public sees now is a man described as lost, but what the system once saw was a man deemed dangerous enough to override his rights. Those two images cannot exist without explanation, and that explanation is still missing. Because if the safeguards failed or were removed too soon, then this story isn't just about one person's collapse. It's about a system that stepped back at the exact moment it mattered most. And in the next chapter, that system doesn't just fail quietly. It fractures publicly, financially, and legally. If Section 1 was about who Nick Reiner was, and Section 2 exposed the systems meant to contain him, then Section 3 is where those systems finally collapse. Because no matter how complex the legal structures, diagnoses, or family dynamics were, everything ultimately converged on a single night that now defines the entire case. By the time authorities arrived at the Reiner residence, the situation was already beyond repair. What they encountered wasn't chaos in motion, but aftermath. A silence heavy enough to suggest that whatever violence had occurred was sudden, decisive, and irreversible. This wasn't a prolonged standoff. It wasn't an accident spiraling out of control. It was an event that ended as quickly as it began, and that's precisely what makes it so disturbing. Investigators would later confirm that the victim, Michelle Reiner, had suffered fatal stab wounds. The brutality of the act sent immediate shockwaves through both law enforcement and the community. This wasn't random. It wasn't an intruder. It happened inside a home that was supposed to be safe, a space defined by familiarity, history, and trust. Nick was still there when police arrived. That detail matters more than it seems. In many violent incidents, the suspect flees, panics, or attempts to evade responsibility. Here, none of that happened. According to early reports, Nick appeared disoriented, confused, and strangely detached from what had just occurred. He did not resist arrest. He did not attempt to explain himself. He simply existed in the wreckage of a moment that had already destroyed everything. Officers on the scene reportedly described his behavior as vacant, not panicked, not emotional, vacant. That observation would later become a cornerstone of the defense narrative. But law enforcement sees this pattern often, and they don't interpret it the same way the public does. Emotional detachment after extreme violence can mean many things: shock, dissociation, or something else entirely. What it does not automatically mean is innocence, incapacity, or unawareness. In the hours following the arrest, Nick was taken into custody without incident. Medical evaluations began almost immediately. These weren't informal assessments. These were formal examinations triggered by the seriousness of the crime and Nick's history. Doctors weren't just evaluating mental health, they were assessing competence. Could he understand what had happened? Could he comprehend where he was? Could he participate in his own defense? At first, the answers were unclear. Sources familiar with the early evaluations say Nick fluctuated dramatically. Some moments he appeared coherent, able to respond appropriately to questions. Other times, he seemed lost, unable to track conversations or recall basic details. That inconsistency set off alarms. Because true cognitive collapse usually presents as a steady decline, not a switch that flips on and off. Still, the violence itself couldn't be ignored. Prosecutors reviewing the scene focused on intentionality, the number of wounds, the proximity, the absence of hesitation. These are factors that matter in court because they speak to deliberation. And deliberation is the line between mental illness and criminal responsibility. Meanwhile, the media began circling. Initial reports were cautious, even restrained. But as details leaked the identity of the family, the prior conservatorship, the substance abuse rumors, the story metastasized. Headlines shifted from tragedy to spectacle. Commentators began debating whether Nick was a victim of mental illness or a danger that should have been contained. That public debate would soon influence everything, because behind the scenes, legal strategies were already taking shape. Defense attorneys began laying the groundwork for an incompetence claim. Not insanity incompetence, a crucial distinction. Insanity focuses on mental state at the time of the act. Incompetence focuses on mental state during trial. And incompetence can pause everything. If Nick couldn't understand the proceedings, there would be no trial, no testimony, no resolution, just indefinite evaluation. And suddenly, the question wasn't what happened that night. The question became whether the legal system would ever allow that night to be examined in open court. As weeks passed, Nick's condition reportedly deteriorated further while in custody. But deterioration without explanation is a legal problem, especially when it appears selective, especially when it aligns perfectly with procedural advantage. This is where skepticism begins to surface, not from the public, but from professionals. Because the night Michelle Reiner died was violent, tragic, and irreversible. But what followed may prove just as consequential. In the next section, the focus shifts away from the crime itself and toward what happened after, how narrative control, legal maneuvering, and public silence reshaped the entire case. And why some believe the truth didn't disappear that night, it was buried afterward. By the time the shock of the crime began to fade, something else had taken its place: silence. Not the natural quiet that follows grief, but a deliberate, structured absence of information. Court updates slowed. Public records became harder to access. Statements stopped coming. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the case slipped out of the daily news cycle. That disappearance wasn't accidental. In high-profile criminal cases, attention is usually inevitable. Cameras gather. Commentators speculate. Documents leak. But here, the opposite happened. The louder the public curiosity grew, the more the system seemed to retreat. Proceedings were postponed. Evaluations were sealed. And Nick Reiner himself vanished into a legal limbo that few outside the courtroom could penetrate. At the center of that limbo was a single legal determination: competency. Once the court accepted that Nick might not be mentally competent to stand trial, everything changed. Trials don't move forward without competency. Evidence isn't tested. Witnesses aren't cross-examined. The narrative freezes in place, and freezing the narrative can be extraordinarily useful. Because a frozen case doesn't invite scrutiny, mental health professionals were brought in. Then more were added. Evaluations stretched from weeks into months. Each report introduced cautious language, unable to assist counsel, limited comprehension, ongoing cognitive impairment. None of it definitive, none of it final. Just enough uncertainty to justify delay. And delay, in this context, became strategy. Legal experts watching from the outside began to notice the pattern. Competency restoration programs are typically designed to improve a defendant's condition. Treatment, medication, structured environments. The goal is stabilization. But insiders familiar with Nick's custody status claim improvement never seemed to arrive, or at least, it was never acknowledged. That raised a difficult question: was recovery failing, or was recovery inconvenient? Because if Nick were declared competent, the case would restart immediately. Evidence would come back into focus. Prosecutors would regain momentum. And the night of the crime, every detail of it would be dissected publicly, relentlessly. Silence would end. At the same time, the Reiner family retreated completely from public view. No interviews, no press conferences, no public appeals. Their grief was real, but so was their privacy. And in that vacuum, speculation flourished. Some believed the family wanted distance to heal. Others believed distance was necessary to avoid contradiction, because grief and legal positioning don't always align cleanly. Saying the wrong thing at the wrong time could collapse carefully constructed arguments. Meanwhile, prosecutors faced an impossible dilemma. Push too hard, and they risked appearing cruel toward someone deemed mentally unwell. Pull back, and the case would effectively stall forever. Justice delayed doesn't just feel like justice denied, it erodes public trust. And yet, the delays continued. Court hearings were brief and procedural. Motions referenced sealed documents. Transcripts were sparse. Each appearance ended the same way: continued evaluation, continued uncertainty. What made this even more unsettling was the absence of a clear endpoint. Incompetency doesn't have a built-in expiration date. A defendant can remain in evaluation for years, sometimes indefinitely, especially when improvement is deemed unlikely. And that creates a legal black hole. Victims never receive closure. The public never receives answers. And accountability dissolves into clinical language and procedural fog. Behind the scenes, some legal observers began to whisper about precedent. Because if this case never reaches trial, it becomes an example, a roadmap for how high-stakes criminal exposure can be neutralized without acquittal, without conviction, and without resolution. No verdict, no headline, no finality, just silence. And silence protects everyone except the truth. Because the longer this case remains unresolved, the harder it becomes to reconstruct what actually happened. Memories fade. Evidence ages. Public attention moves on. The story softens, then disappears entirely. But unresolved cases don't vanish. They calcify. They sit beneath the surface, shaping future decisions, future strategies, future failures. And when people look back, they won't just ask what Nick Reiner did, they'll ask what the system allowed to happen afterward. In the final section, that question becomes unavoidable, because eventually, silence isn't neutral. It becomes its own kind of verdict. This case will never be remembered solely for the violence of that night. It will be remembered for what followed: the delays, the sealed doors, the unanswered questions, and the quiet way accountability slipped out of reach. Because when a system built to deliver justice chooses suspension over resolution, it doesn't pause the truth. It distorts it. Nick Reiner's story sits at the intersection of mental illness, family loyalty, legal maneuvering, and institutional failure. Each layer on its own is complicated. Together, they form a structure where responsibility becomes negotiable and truth becomes conditional. A life was lost, yet the process designed to honor that loss has been frozen in procedural uncertainty. What makes this case unsettling isn't just what we know, it's what we may never be allowed to know. No trial means no testimony. No testimony means no clarity. And without clarity, justice becomes theoretical rather than real. The public is left with fragments instead of answers, speculation instead of facts, and silence instead of resolution. Cases like this don't simply disappear. They linger, shaping how future decisions are made behind closed doors, reminding us that when systems fail quietly, the consequences are anything but small. If you value deep, responsible coverage of cases like this, where the truth matters more than headlines, consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to support long-form investigative storytelling that refuses to let important stories fade into silence.